Aloha and welcome back to the Acts Bible Study brought to you by Waiakea Baptist Bible Church in Hilo, Hawaii. I'm Jim Peterson, your moderator, and today we're going to be looking at Lesson 23 that displays some great faith by the Apostle Paul as he returns back to Jerusalem. And he's been confronted by, as we learned in Acts 22, he's been confronted by a very angry mob. And so let's get right into it, because he now has spent a night in prison. The Roman commander, as you remember, really saved him, literally, as the angry mob was about to kill him. So he spent overnight in Jerusalem in the barracks of the Roman troops that were stationed there, because the commander of the Roman troops ordered him to have a hearing before the Sanhedrin on the following day. So read with me, would you, in your Bibles, as we take a look at what happens here in the beginning part of Acts 23. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. So he ordered troops to go down and take him away by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Well, as you can see from that text, and I'm sure from your own reading, perhaps earlier this week, that meeting doesn't begin very well. He opens his message to the Sanhedrin, proclaiming that he has fulfilled his duty to God, and then the high priest has him struck in the mouth. And then Paul, unfortunately, insults the high priest who presides over the Sanhedrin for having illegally struck him on the mouth. And so but Paul remembers that it's illegal to speak about the ruler of God's people, and then he says something that he didn't know, that Ananias was the high priest. But it seems to me very unlikely that Paul was a very astute man who was astute, well versed in government laws, politics, Jewish traditions, that he wouldn't be aware that Ananias was the high priest. But I take him at his word. What was Paul, do you think, justified by insulting Ananias the high priest in what we read in verse 3 of chapter 23? What do you think? Probably something we all would have been very tempted to do under those circumstances. But I don't think he was. I think insulting someone has no place in our ministry to other people or in our relationships with others. Can't think of a time when I've done that in the past that's ever been, whether it's ministering to somebody or whether it's just being in someone's presence and insulting one. I just don't see that ever brings out any benefit. And what, to me, by insulting somebody, we basically don't distinguish ourselves from people who do not have a relationship with God. Well, then, as we read, Paul threw the Sanhedrin a curveball. He informs the Sanhedrin that he's a Pharisee and he believes he's on trial because of his hope in the resurrection of the dead, and he knew full well that that's exactly what the Pharisees believed. And so that statement brings support for Paul from the Pharisees, even though they're a minority of the Sanhedrin. And of course, as you would expect, the Sanhedrin got very excited over his statement about the resurrection of the dead, and that led to a big dispute between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And some of the Pharisees concluded that there was nothing wrong with Paul. But it gets so hot in that meeting that the Roman commander forcefully gets Paul out of the meeting and takes him back to the barracks. Well, what do we learn from Acts 23:11 about how God supports the ministry's efforts of his followers? To me, it's another example that we see repeated throughout the book of Acts, that God encourages those of us who are willing to minister to other people. And then the other is that he gives us guidance about what to do next, regardless of what the situation is. But meanwhile, back at the ranch, some Jews in Jerusalem, they have other ideas. And let's read on now in Acts 23, beginning in verse 12. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priest and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with a warning, "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." So the Jews, those who are excited about Paul returning to Jerusalem, they're stopping at nothing. They will look at all angles of the situation and seeking for a way to continue to kill him. By the way, that oath that these 40 men wanted to take, that solemn oath was called a sherem. And that was, the Jews regarded murder as legitimate if a man sought by residents represented a danger to public morals and life. And when they would take such a vow, a man would say, "May God curse me if I fail to do this." But as we just read, the nephew of Paul comes to the barracks, tells Paul about what he heard, or perhaps what other family members heard, and then he is directed to share that with the commander. All right, back in verse 23 let's see what happens. Then he called 2 of his centurions, that meaning the commander of the Roman troops. He called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. And the next day they let the cavalry go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So Paul's return now is getting complicated, isn't it? Even more, though, than when we thought from the beginning. And so Paul now is transported under heavy security to the provincial seat of the Roman governor in that region for a hearing before Governor Felix. And that is quite a force: 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. And we learned that journey in Acts 23, verse 31, they traveled with Paul, 200 soldiers, between Jerusalem and Antipatris. It was about a 30-mile trip up to Caesarea, but the first 10 miles were the most dangerous because there were quite a few number of Jews that were living along that route. Well, do you see God's hand in protecting Paul from this angry Jewish mob? And how did God do it? And who did he use? Well, you can certainly see it, how Paul just narrowly gets through that entire scene from a very angry mob and the response of the Roman commander, and then him protecting him once he learned that he was a Roman citizen. And then it just so happened that Paul's family learned about the plot to kill Paul by his young nephew, and then the commander responds by sending a highly security force to safely deliver Paul to the governor Felix in Caesarea. And of course that as he sends that prisoner, he sends along that letter to Governor Felix. And then after he reviews the letter, the governor agrees to hear that case once Paul's accusers arrive in Caesarea, which we'll read about in Acts 24, and he's placed under guard in Herod's palace in Caesarea. And you might have noted, if you have read through the lesson material, that it's interesting that Governor Felix began his life as a slave, and he's one of the few people, or in fact he was the first slave in Roman history to eventually become governor of a Roman province. You see, his brother was favored by Nero, and Felix had governed the province of Judea for 5 years after serving a couple of years in Samaria. And the Roman historian Tacitus said of Governor Felix that he exercised the prerogatives of a king with the spirit of a slave. Well, that's all we have here in Acts 23 today. I think as I reflect on this chapter, as Paul is going through this, just the wonderful response of God, that he watches over us, he guides us every step of the way as we work willing to be faithful to his instructions, and in this case the instructions to share the gospel. And that Paul did, and he did it courageously, and it demonstrates to me that his faith, how strong it was, how because he was in regular communication with God, because he was in the Word of God, it was just a wonderful relationship between God and a man who formerly was persecuting the people of the way. Well, God bless you, and I pray that you'll continue in our study as your lesson materials come next week for lesson 24 from our study of the book of Acts. May God bless and keep you and watch over you.